Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. This time, we're taking a close look at Zero Trust architecture. Um, it's one of those topics that can feel pretty overwhelming at first glance.
Absolutely, yeah. And the Cloud Security Alliance study guide you sent over, well, let's just say it's pretty dense.
Yeah, it's a bit of a beast, isn't it? But hey, that's what we're here for, to break it down and really understand what makes ZTA tick. So maybe we could start with, the big picture. What is it about ZTA that makes it so different from traditional security approaches?
Well, I think the most striking thing about ZTA is that it completely flips the script on how we think about security. You see, traditional security, it's kind of like building a fortress, right? You protect the perimeter, and you assume that everything inside is safe.
Right, that classic castle and moat approach.
Right.
But ZTA is saying that's not enough anymore.
Exactly. ZTA says, look, we can't just assume that everyone and everything inside the network is trustworthy. We need to verify every single access request, no matter where it's coming from.
So it's like having a security checkpoint at every single door,
Yeah.
even inside the castle walls.
Yeah, precisely. It's that constant verification, the never trust, always verify principle that really sets ZTA apart.
Okay, starting to get it. So no more free passes just because someone is logged into the company network. But I'm curious, where did this whole zero trust idea come from? Who came up with it, and when did it start gaining traction?
Well, the term zero trust itself, it was coined by John Kindervag back in 2010 or so. He's considered the grandfather of ZTA, so to speak. But, the funny thing is the concept was actually brewing even before that.
Oh, really? So who were the early adopters, the pioneers of zero trust?
Well, you might be surprised to hear that the Department of Defense was already exploring these ideas. Back in the early 2000s, they had this project called Black Core, which was basically a super secure network designed to protect critical military data. I mean, they were already recognizing that they needed a more robust security model for these, increasingly digital systems.
Wow, that's fascinating. So even the military was ahead of the curve on this.
Yeah.
But how has ZTA evolved since then? I mean, has it stayed pretty much the same, or has it changed and adapted as technology has advanced?
Oh, it's definitely evolved. In the beginning, ZTA was very focused on data-centric network design. The idea was to build security around the data itself, no matter where it resided. But then, we saw this huge explosion of cloud computing and mobile devices.
Right. Everyone and everything is on the move these days.
Exactly. And that really shifted the focus to a more identity-centric approach. It wasn't just about protecting the data anymore. It became all about verifying who was accessing it, from what device, and from where.
So it's become much more granular, more focused on the individual user and their specific context.
Right. Because think about it. If you don't know who's accessing your data or from what device or from where, how can you possibly trust that access?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's not just about the what anymore. It's about the who, the how, and the where as well. But I'm still curious, what was the real turning point, the event that really made people sit up and take notice of ZTA?
Well, I'd say that was Google's Beyond Corp project. I mean, they really put ZTA on the map.
Right. I've heard of Beyond Corp, but I'm still a bit fuzzy on the details. Can you give us a quick rundown?
Sure. Basically, Beyond Corp was Google's internal solution for implementing ZTA across their entire organization. And it was a huge success. They showed everyone that ZTA could be done, and not just in some theoretical way, but in a real-world, large-scale environment.
So they basically said, look, the traditional network perimeter is dead. We're going to build security from the ground up, assuming that everyone is outside the network.
Exactly. And they went all in on it. They ditched the traditional VPN, stopped relying on firewalls as their primary line of defense, and really embraced that never trust, always verify principle.
So they put their money where their mouth was, so to speak. But getting back to the Cloud Security Alliance study guide you sent over, how do they define ZTA? I mean, what's their official take on it?
Well, they define zero trust architecture as a cybersecurity approach that starts by making no assumptions about an entity's trustworthiness. So, right off the bat, there are no pre-established entitlements. And it goes on to say that every single access request needs to be verified, regardless of where the request is coming from.
So it's like starting with a blank slate, a clean sheet of paper, and building security from the ground up. No one gets a free pass.
Exactly. It's about constantly questioning, constantly verifying, never assuming that anyone or anything is inherently trustworthy.
Okay, I'm really starting to grasp the core philosophy here, but what are the actual components that make up this ZTA system? What are the building blocks, so to speak?
Well, the CSA outlines three primary components: You have communication, which is basically the access request itself and the resulting session. Then you have identity, which, that's pretty straightforward. It's who is trying to access the resource. And finally, you have resources, which refers to the assets, the applications, the data, whatever it is that the user is trying to get to.
So those are like the nouns of ZTA, the things that are involved in the process. But there's got to be more to it than that, right? It's not just about identifying things. It's about what you do with them, what actions are taken.
You're absolutely right. And that's where the two other fundamental elements come in. Think of these as the verbs of ZTA. You have policy, which governs access, and data sources, which provide information that allows policies to be updated dynamically.
So it's not just static rules. The system can actually learn and adapt based on new information, new threats, new contexts.
Exactly. That dynamic element is crucial, especially in today's rapidly changing threat landscape.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But with all this complexity, all these moving parts, I imagine ZTA is designed to achieve some pretty specific objectives.
Absolutely. ZTA isn't just some theoretical concept. It's designed to achieve very practical, real-world goals, both from a technical and a business perspective.
Okay, so it's like a multi-tool addressing a variety of needs. Let's start with the technical side. What are some of the key objectives that ZTA aims to achieve?
Well, one of the primary objectives is to establish what the CSA calls a protective framework. Now, what this means is that you're not just focusing on protecting the network itself. Instead, you're shifting the focus to understanding what needs to be protected, your crown jewels, so to speak, and building your security around that.
So it's about protecting the data, not just the container it's in. That
No.
seems like a much more focused approach. What else?
Another key objective is to reduce management overhead by simplifying access control. We've all seen those complicated webs of permissions and access lists that can be a real nightmare to manage.
Oh, yeah, I've been there. Spent hours trying to untangle those messes.
Right. So ZTA aims to streamline all that, make it easier to manage who has access to what, and ensure that only authorized users can access sensitive resources.
So happier IT teams and more secure systems. It's a win-win. What other technical objectives does ZTA address?
Well, another big one is reducing the attack surface. By minimizing the number of points of vulnerability, it becomes much harder for attackers to even get a foothold in your systems. And this goes hand in hand with reducing complexity. Instead of trying to protect this massive, sprawling network, you're creating these smaller, more manageable, more secure zones within your IT environment.
So instead of one giant castle with a huge perimeter to defend, you're creating these smaller, more defensible fortresses within the larger structure. It's almost like those medieval cities with multiple walls and gates.
Mm-hmm.
Even if attackers breach the outer defenses, they still face barriers at every turn.
I like that analogy. That's a great way to visualize it. And that leads us nicely into the next objective, enforcing the principle of least privilege. This is all about making sure that each user and each application only gets the access that they absolutely need to do their specific job. No more, no less.
So it's a need-to-know basis for access. No more giving everyone admin rights just in case. Right.
Exactly. And by implementing these principles, ZTA really helps to significantly improve your overall security posture and your resilience. With constant verification and micro-segmentation, your systems become much more resistant to attack.
It's not just about building a strong fortress. It's about making sure that everyone inside the fortress is well-behaved too. It sounds like ZTA is constantly on guard, constantly monitoring and verifying every action, like a really, really vigilant security guard.
That's a great way to put it. And that vigilance plays a big role in the final technical objective, which is improved incident containment and management. So even if something does go wrong, ZTA helps to limit the blast radius to prevent a breach in one area from spreading throughout your entire network.
It sounds like it's not just about preventing attacks. It's about minimizing the damage if an attack does succeed. So it's a more holistic approach to security.
Absolutely. And that's really the beauty of ZTA. It's not just about locking things down. It's about making your systems more resilient, more adaptable, and more able to withstand the inevitable attacks that will come your way.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground already, but I do want to make sure we touch on the business side of things. ZTA isn't just about technology, right? It's also about aligning with an organization's overall business objectives. So how does ZTA achieve that? What are some of the business goals that it addresses?
You're absolutely right. ZTA isn't just about bolstering security for security's sake. It's about aligning with an organization's overall success. And that means addressing those key business objectives. And one of the most important is risk reduction.
Okay, so instead of having a bunch of different security solutions that might not always work together, You have this one overarching approach that covers everything.
Exactly. ZTA helps you consolidate and simplify your security strategy, making it much more efficient and effective. And that leads into another crucial objective: compliance management. With its emphasis on data protection and auditing, ZTA makes it so much easier for organizations to meet those increasingly stringent regulatory requirements, like, GDPR, for example.
Right. So ZTA isn't just about protecting data, it's about proving that you're doing it right, which is essential in today's world. But I'm curious about the people involved. Does ZTA just create more work for IT teams, or does it actually make their lives easier?
That's a great question. And, one of the often overlooked business objectives of ZTA is organizational improvement. It's about fostering a security-aware culture and streamlining processes through automation.
So it's not just about the tech, it's about the people and how they work together.
Exactly. It's about changing mindsets and behaviors, making security a core part of the organization's DNA. And automation plays a huge role in that, freeing up IT teams from tedious manual tasks so they can focus on more strategic initiatives.
Okay, so we've covered the objectives, both technical and business related, but let's get down to brass tacks here. What are the tangible benefits of ZTA? How does all of this translate to real-world improvements for an organization?
Well, one of the most significant benefits, and this is probably no surprise, is a reduced risk of compromise. ZTA achieves this by shrinking the attack surface, making it much harder for those bad actors to gain a foothold in your systems. And remember those islands of security we talked about, that microsegmentation. That's a key part of it because it limits the blast radius of any security incident.
So even if something does happen, the impact is contained. It's like damage control on a massive scale.
Exactly. But it's not just about preventing attacks, right? What about that whole never trust, always verify thing? How does that actually translate into a tangible benefit?
Yeah, I'm curious about that too. It sounds good in theory, but how does it play out in practice?
Well, that principle leads to another major benefit: increased trustworthiness of access. ZTA scrutinizes every single access attempt, ensuring that only those with the right credentials and permissions can get their hands on those sensitive resources.
It's like having a super secure vault where everything is under lock and key, and the guards are constantly checking IDs, even for people they think they recognize.
Precisely. But, this constant verification, it generates a lot of data, a lot of information about who's accessing what, from where, and when. And that leads us to another benefit, which is increased visibility and analytics.
Right. So it's not just about reacting to threats after they happen. It's about proactively identifying and addressing those threats before they become a major problem. And I bet this ties in with improved compliance as well, right? I mean, ZTA is all about tracking access, monitoring activity, and enforcing those strict security policies. So that should make it easier to prove that you're meeting those regulatory requirements, right?
You bet. With its emphasis on data protection, continuous monitoring, and detailed auditing, ZTA makes it much easier to demonstrate compliance with those sometimes really burdensome regulatory requirements.
Okay, so we got reduced risk, increased trustworthiness, better visibility, improved compliance. Are there any other perks to ZTA that we should mention?
Well, beyond those core security benefits, ZTA can also lead to cost reduction, streamlined IT management, and even a better user experience.
So it's not just about adding more security. It's about doing security smarter, making it more efficient and more user-friendly.
Exactly. And that's really the ultimate goal: to create a security posture that is both robust and adaptable, one that can protect your organization without hindering its ability to innovate and grow.
Well said. But I have a feeling that actually implementing ZTA isn't exactly a walk in the park, right?
You're right about that. Implementing ZTA, it's not just a matter of flipping a switch. It requires careful planning, thoughtful consideration of your specific needs and circumstances, and a willingness to embrace change. It's a journey, not a destination.
Okay, so where do you even begin? Where's the starting line for this ZTA journey?
Well, the very first step, before you do anything else, is to understand your needs. This means asking some critical questions. Why are we considering ZTA in the first place? What are our most valuable assets, the things we absolutely need to protect? How critical is ZTA to our overall mission and objectives? And very importantly, what are the potential costs, both of adopting ZTA and of not adopting it?
It sounds like it's not just a technical decision. It's a strategic one that requires buy-in from everyone involved. So who are the key players that you need to get on board with this?
Yeah, that's crucial. You need to identify all your key stakeholders. This includes everyone from the business owners who understand the organization's goals and risk appetite to the security teams who will be responsible for implementation and day-to-day management. And of course, you need to bring in the IT folks who will be responsible for actually integrating ZTA into your existing infrastructure.
So it's about building a coalition of the willing, making sure that everyone understands the benefits of ZTA and how it aligns with the organization's overall objectives. What comes next?
Once you have your stakeholders on board, you need to assemble a team, a group of experts who can evaluate your current IT landscape, identify any potential roadblocks, and develop a solid plan for implementation. Think of them as your ZTA SWAT team, ready to tackle the challenge head-on.
I like the sound of that. But before you send in the SWAT team, you need to know what you're dealing with, right? You need to assess the lay of the land.
Exactly. The next step is defining your current state. This involves a thorough self-assessment of your organization's security practices. You need to look at your governance, your risk management, your asset management, your existing cybersecurity controls, and identify your strengths, weaknesses, and any areas that need improvement. It's like getting a security checkup before you embark on a major fitness regime.
So it's all about getting a baseline, knowing where you're starting from so you can create a realistic and achievable plan.
Exactly. Once you have a clear picture of your current state, it's time to set those goals. Define both short-term and long-term objectives for your ZTA adoption. What do you want to achieve in the next 6 months? What about in the next year? What's the long-term vision?
So it's about breaking down this potentially overwhelming task into smaller, more manageable steps.
Right.
You don't have to boil the ocean all at once.
Exactly. It's about taking a strategic, phased approach. But one of the most important things to remember when setting those goals is to be realistic. Don't try to do too much too soon. Take into account your budget, your resources, and your existing infrastructure.
So it's about pacing yourself, not biting off more than you can chew. What's the next step in this ZTA journey? What comes after setting those realistic goals?
The next critical step is defining those use cases. Be crystal clear about the specific applications and scenarios where you plan to implement ZTA. Do you want to use it to replace your existing VPN? Secure your cloud applications. Protect your industrial control systems. Having a clear vision of how ZTA will be used within your organization is essential.
So it's about tailoring ZTA to your specific needs and priorities. But I imagine this is a team effort, right? It can't just be one person calling all the shots.
You got it. The final step in the planning process, and this is a crucial one, is developing a solid collaboration plan. You need seamless communication and coordination between all the teams involved in the ZTA deployment, from the planning stages all the way through to implementation.
So it's about breaking down those silos, getting everyone on the same page, working together toward that common goal of creating a more secure organization.
Absolutely. You need to make sure that everyone understands their role, knows what's expected of them, and has the tools and resources they need to succeed.
Well said. This has been an excellent overview of the planning phase of ZTA adoption. But I imagine there are a lot of different ways to actually implement ZTA. I mean, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, right?
Oh, absolutely not. There are a variety of ZTA implementations out there, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. And since your focus is on network security, we'll dive into the two main approaches highlighted in the NIST documentation. ZTA using microsegmentation and ZTA using network infrastructure and software-defined perimeters. We'll also look at three prominent ZTA implementations that have sort of, influenced each other over time. Software-defined perimeter, SDP, Zero Trust Network Access, ZTNA, and of course, Google Beyond Corp, which we talked about earlier.
Okay, so let's start with SDP. What exactly is it, and how does it differ from those traditional security approaches we've been talking about?
Well, think of SDP as a way to create those invisible walls we talked about earlier. It's all about building this fortress around your most sensitive data and resources, cutting them off from the rest of the network, and allowing access only after thorough verification.
So it's like having this secret hidden room that only authorized personnel can even find, let alone enter.
That's a great analogy. SDP is all about pre-vetting those connections, ensuring that only those authenticated and authorized users and devices can even see that protected network, let alone actually connect to it.
That sounds incredibly secure. But I'm curious, how does SDP actually achieve that? What's the magic behind the curtain, so to speak?
Well, it's a bit like having a high-tech bouncer checking IDs at an exclusive club. There are a few key components involved.
Okay, I'm ready for the SDP lineup. Who are the players in this security dance?
Well, first, You have the initiating host, which is just a fancy way of saying the user's device or system that's trying to access those protected resources. Then you have the accepting host, which is like the gatekeeper. It's the system hosting those sensitive resources and deciding who gets in. Think of it as the VIP area of the club.
Got it. So that's who's trying to get in and where they're trying to go. Who else is involved?
Next up, you have the SDP controller, which is like the brain of the operation. It's responsible for authenticating users and devices, provisioning those secure connections, and enforcing those all-important security policies. Think of it as the master control panel for your security system.
So the controller's making sure everyone plays by the rules, that no one sneaks in through the back door.
Exactly. And finally, manning the door, you have the SDP gateway. This acts like a super strict bouncer. It essentially implements what's known as a drop-off firewall, meaning that it blocks all traffic by default.
So it's not just a matter of knocking on the door and hoping for the best. You need to present the right credentials and pass a thorough security check before you're even allowed to see the door, let alone step inside.
I like this SDP approach. It sounds pretty solid. But how does it align with those core ZT principles we talked about earlier? Does it actually walk the talk? Oh, absolutely. SDP embodies those principles perfectly. It ensures that users and devices are authenticated and authorized before they can even connect to the accepting host. It enforces the principle of least privilege by only granting access to those specific resources that the user is authorized to use. And very importantly, it continuously monitors and logs all those network communications, leaving in a detailed audit trail.
So it's not just a one-time check. It's ongoing vigilance, making sure that no one is overstaying their welcome or snooping around where they shouldn't be. But with all this talk about SDP's security prowess, I'm sure there are different ways to actually deploy it. Is it a one-size-fits-all solution? Or are there different flavors of SDP?
Oh, definitely not one size fits all. One of the great things about SDP is its flexibility. You can choose the implementation that best fits your organization's needs and environment. The controller can be located on-premise or in the cloud. The gateway can be deployed on physical servers or as virtual appliances. You can tailor SDP to protect a single service or multiple services. It's really quite versatile.
So it's customizable, adaptable, that's great. But can you give me some real-world examples of how SDP is being used? A concrete scenario where it really shines.
Absolutely. One scenario where SDP is incredibly valuable is in cloud-to-cloud communication. Imagine an organization that's using multiple cloud providers, say, one for their applications and another for their databases. SDP can ensure that data flows securely between these different cloud environments without having to route everything back through the organization's own network.
So it streamlines data flow and enhances security at the same time. A win-win. Are there any other compelling SDP use cases that come to mind?
Another great example is what we call collaboration across boundaries. Think of organizations that need to share data securely with external partners, maybe for joint ventures or research projects. SDP allows them to do this without compromising their overall security posture. It's like having a secure virtual meeting room where you can collaborate with those trusted partners without worrying about eavesdroppers listening in.
That makes a lot of sense. It's all about creating those secure enclaves, those trusted spaces where sensitive information can be shared without risk. So SDP sounds pretty fantastic, but I'm sure there are some downsides as well, right?
Well, of course, no security solution is perfect. One potential drawback of SDP is that it typically requires a client agent to be installed on every endpoint that needs to connect that protected network.
So there's some upfront effort involved in getting everything set up, making sure that all the devices are properly configured.
Right. But, in many cases, the benefits far outweigh this initial effort. And another potential limitation is that SDP, while it's excellent for traditional user access methods, like someone sitting at a computer trying to access an application, it doesn't always handle things like API-based access, microservices, or serverless architectures as effectively.
So it's not the ideal solution for every scenario, but it's definitely a powerful tool for enforcing those core ZT principles, especially when it comes to securing those traditional network access methods.
Exactly. And it's a mature technology with a proven track record, so it's definitely worth considering for organizations looking to implement ZTA.
Okay, great. So we've covered SDP. Now let's move on to Zero Trust Network Access, often referred to as ZTNA. How does ZTNA differ from SDP? They sound kind of similar.
They are, conceptually, yeah. In fact, ZTNA, it actually draws inspiration from SDP. You could even say that ZTNA is sort of a more evolved version of SDP, specifically designed for today's increasingly cloud-centric and remote work environments.
So it's SDP on steroids, ready to tackle the challenges of the modern workplace.
Yeah, you could say that. The main idea behind ZTNA is to grant secure remote access to applications and services without requiring users to first connect to the corporate network. So it's seen by many as a more modern and robust replacement for those, those often clunky and insecure traditional VPNs.
Right, right. No more connecting to the office network just to access a cloud application. That always seemed a bit backwards.
Exactly. With ZTNA, users can connect directly to the specific applications they need, regardless of where they are, what device they're using, or what network they're on. And like SDP, it relies on strong authentication and encryption to ensure that only those authorized users are granted access.
It sounds like a much smoother and more secure way to work remotely, especially with so many people working from home these days. But you mentioned different architectures for ZTNA. Can you explain those a bit more?
Sure. There are two main approaches: endpoint-initiated ZTNA and service-initiated ZTNA.
Two flavors of ZTNA. Intriguing. What are the key differences?
With endpoint-initiated ZTNA, you install a lightweight agent on the user's device. This agent then communicates with a ZTNA controller to authenticate the user and establish a secure connection to the application.
So that's similar to SDP, where both require an agent on the user's device to make the connection. What about service-initiated ZTNA? How does that work?
Well, in service-initiated ZTNA, you have a connector instead of an agent on the user's device that sits in front of the service itself, whether that service is in your data center or in the cloud.
So the security is handled on the server side, not on the user's device.
Exactly. And when a user wants to access the application, they first connect to this ZTNA broker, which authenticates them and establishes that secure connection to the service.
So it's like having this secure middleman who verifies everyone's identity before allowing them to connect to the application.
Precisely. And this service-initiated approach is especially useful when you're dealing with unmanaged devices, like in a bring-your-own-device, BYO scenario, or when you need to grant access to those external partners.
So it offers more flexibility in terms of managing different types of devices and users. But how does ZTNA actually measure up against those core ZT principles we talked about earlier? Does it really embrace those principles, or is it just paying lip service?
Oh no, ZTNA, it truly embodies those principles. It's built from the ground up with the understanding that you can't trust anything by default. It assumes that a breach could happen at any time.
So it's a trust no one approach to security.
Exactly, and that's why it's called Zero Trust Network Access. So it verifies every access attempt, reduces the attack surface by hiding those services behind brokers, and only grants access to those users who have explicit policies granting them permission.
So it's not just paying lip service to ZT, it's baking those principles into its very DNA. But when it comes to actually deploying ZTNA, what are the options?
Well, you have a couple of choices. You can go with a standalone product where that ZTNA broker runs on your premises, or you can opt for a managed ZTNA service, which is often offered by those cloud providers.
So you can choose the option that best suits your needs, your resources, and your comfort level with managing security infrastructure.
Exactly. And with more and more organizations embracing cloud services and remote work, ZTNA is rapidly becoming the preferred solution for secure access.
But what are those key advantages of ZTNA? What makes it stand out from the crowd, especially when compared to those traditional VPNs it's aiming to replace?
ZTNA really excels in the three key areas: user experience, agility, and simplified policy management. For users, especially those working remotely, it's a much smoother experience. They don't have to deal with the hassles of VPNs like slow connections, drop sessions, or frustrating configuration issues.
So it's a win for user productivity and satisfaction. And what about the IT side of things?
From an IT perspective, ZTNA is much easier to manage and adapt to changing needs. Those security policies are more granular, more flexible, allowing you to really fine-tune that access control based on the individual user, the specific device, and the application they're trying to access.
So it's more adaptable and less of a headache for those who are managing security. But I want to ask, are there any downsides?
Of course. Like any solution, ZTNA has its limitations. One is that that endpoint-initiated approach, it can be tricky to implement if you're dealing with those unmanaged devices, like those BYOD situations. And, while it's great at securing that remote access, ZTNA can't really protect against threats that are already inside the network.
So it's not a silver bullet for all your security woes, but it's definitely a powerful tool for securing remote access, especially as we move away from those often vulnerable VPNs.
Precisely. And now we can't really talk about ZTA without discussing Google Beyond Corp. I mean, it's the OG of ZTA.
Absolutely. BeyondCorp was the one that really showed everyone that ZTA could be done, and done effectively at a massive scale. But remind me, what was so groundbreaking about BeyondCorp? What problem did it solve that others hadn't?
Well, Beyond Corp was Google's way of saying, look, the traditional network perimeter is dead. We need a new way to think about security. And they weren't just talking the talk. They actually walked the walk, implementing ZTA across their entire organization, enabling their employees to securely access those internal resources from anywhere without needing a traditional VPN.
So Google was really ahead of the curve on this. But what was the key insight that drove BeyondCorp? What was their aha moment, so to speak?
I think they realized that relying on a perimeter was kind of like building a fortress with a giant hole in the wall. You can have the strongest walls in the world, but if there's a giant hole that anyone can walk through, those walls aren't going to do you much good.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So how did they actually make this BeyondCorp thing work? What were the key components that made it all come together?
Well, it's a pretty sophisticated system with a lot of moving parts. First, you have the web proxy, which acts as that central point of access control for everything. Then there's a device inventory that keeps track of all the devices that are authorized to access those Google resources. And of course, you have the user and group database that manages all those user identities and permissions.
Right, so it's about knowing who's who, what they're allowed to access, and from what devices. But how do they actually verify all that information? I mean, how do they make sure it's really the authorized user trying to access those resources?
Well, they use a combination of different techniques. For managed devices, like, say, company-issued laptops, they leverage this protocol called 802.1x to verify their security posture and implement that microsegmentation we talked about earlier. And for authentication, they rely heavily on things like multi-factor authentication and digital certificates.
So it's a multi-layered approach, combining different security mechanisms to create a more robust defense. But who's making the final call on who gets access to what? Who's the ultimate judge, jury, and executioner in this BeyondCorp world?
That would be the access control engine. It's like the brain of the whole system. It takes all that information from the device inventory, the user database, and other contextual data, like, say, the user's location, the device's trust levels, even the time of day, and makes a decision based on predefined policies.
So it's not just a static set of rules. It's an intelligent system that can adapt to different situations and make decisions based on all these different factors.
Exactly. It's all about context-aware access control. And that's really what sets BeyondCorp apart from those more traditional security approaches. It's not just about who you are, it's about where you are, what device you're using, what you're trying to access, and a whole bunch of other factors that all come together to create this really comprehensive security profile.
So it's a much more nuanced approach to security, much more granular and adaptable. But how does all of this align with those core ZT principles we talked about earlier? I mean, is BeyondCorp really a true embodiment of ZPA, or is it just paying lip service to the concept?
Oh, BeyondCorp, it's definitely a prime example of ZTA in action. It requires all users and devices to be authenticated and authorized by that access proxy before connecting to any resources. It denies all access requests from any unauthenticated users or devices. It handles each access request individually, adhering to that principle of least privilege, and it continuously monitors all access attempts and communications, logging both legitimate and illegitimate activity.
Wow, it sounds like they really took those ZT principles to heart when they designed BeyondCorp. It's like ZTA baked right into the core of the system. But is there just one way to implement BeyondCorp? I mean, is it a one-size-fits-all solution, or can it be adapted to different environments and needs?
Well, BeyondCorp is Google's proprietary solution, so in its full-fledged form, it's really only accessible within Google's own infrastructure. But some organizations have implemented simplified versions of BeyondCorp, often just focusing on that access proxy component. But to really leverage the full power of BeyondCorp, you need all those components working together in harmony. It's a holistic approach to security.
So full-fledged BeyondCorp is probably best suited for organizations that are heavily invested in Google's ecosystem.
Yeah.
But what are the key advantages that make BeyondCorp so appealing? What are the things that make it stand out from the crowd?
Well, one major advantage of BeyondCorp is that it doesn't require those agents to be installed on user devices. So from a user perspective, it's a much less intrusive approach. No need to install yet another piece of software on your laptop or your phone.
Right. No more software bloat. I can definitely appreciate that. What else?
Another advantage is its centralized and unified approach to security. By managing all access through that central web proxy, Google has this single point of control for enforcing their security policies. It's elegant, efficient, and really quite effective.
I like the sound of that. It's about simplifying security, making it easier to manage and control. But I'm sure there are some downsides to BeyondCorp as well, right? I mean, no system is perfect.
Of course, of course. One potential drawback is that a full-fledged BeyondCorp implementation, it can be less flexible and quite difficult to integrate with existing security mechanisms, especially if you're using those IAM solutions from, say, other vendors.
So it's not exactly a plug-and-play solution for every environment. What about security? I mean, is BeyondCorp as secure as those other ZTA approaches we've discussed? Is it really as secure as Google claims it to be?
That's a great question, and there's definitely some debate about that. You see, because BeyondCorp doesn't use what's known as single packet authorization or mutual TLS, it might not be quite as secure as SDP in terms of creating that truly invisible network. And BeyondCorp, it also relies heavily on the security of Google's own infrastructure, which might be a concern for some organizations that are, hesitant to put all their eggs in one basket.
Right, so there are definitely some trade-offs to consider. But overall, it sounds like BeyondCorp is a pretty impressive implementation of ZTA, even if it's not perfect.
Oh, absolutely. Despite those limitations, BeyondCorp is undoubtedly a groundbreaking ZTA implementation that has really had a profound impact on the entire security landscape.
It's a pioneer that paved the way for those other ZTA solutions, showing the world that it is possible to rethink security from the ground up and create a truly modern and secure IT environment.
Exactly. It's all about shifting that mindset, moving away from that perimeter-based approach, and embracing a more holistic, more context-aware approach to security.
Well said. But let's move on to something a bit more tangible. Can you give me some real-world examples of how all these different ZTA approaches are being used to solve those specific security challenges? Let's see ZTA in action.
Absolutely. One of the most prominent use cases, and we've touched on this already, is replacing VPNs with ZTA for remote access.
Right. We talked about the general idea, but can we dig a little deeper into how ZTA actually addresses those specific limitations of traditional VPNs? Those things we all know and sometimes love to hate.
Sure. Imagine a traditional VPN setup. All those users, regardless of their roles or the specific applications they need to access, they all connect to the corporate network through this single VPN gateway.
So it's like a single entry point for everyone, no matter where they're trying to go within the network.
Exactly. And that creates a few problems. First, it's a potential security bottleneck. If that VPN gateway is compromised, the entire corporate network could be at risk. It's a single point of failure.
Right. So one weak link in the chain can bring down the whole system.
Exactly. And second, VPNs, they often provide those users with, way too much access. Once they're connected, they can potentially access resources that they shouldn't be able to, which, completely violates that principle of least privilege we've been talking about.
So it's not just about keeping the bad guys out. It's about making sure that the good guys only go where they're supposed to go.
Precisely. And third, VPNs, let's be honest, they can be a real pain for users, especially those who are working remotely. They often experience those slow connections, drop sessions, and, other performance issues that can be really frustrating.
Yeah, I've been there. It's like trying to drive through rush hour traffic to get to the office, even though you could just as easily work from home.
I love that analogy. So how does ZTA actually solve these problems? Well, as we discussed earlier, ZTNA, it provides a much more granular and secure approach to that remote access. It allows those users to connect directly to the applications they need without first having to traverse the corporate network, which eliminates that single point of failure and reduces the risk of a network-wide compromise. And it relies on that strong authentication and encryption to ensure that only authorized users can access those applications.
So it's a much more targeted and secure approach, like giving each user a personalized key card that only unlocks the specific doors they're allowed to enter.
Exactly. And because ZTNA, it grants users access based on their roles and those specific applications they need to do their jobs, it enforces that principle of least privilege, preventing them from accessing resources that they shouldn't have access to.
It's all about that need-to-know basis. Only access what you need when you need it.
Precisely. And as a bonus, ZTNA, it often provides a much better user experience.
Yeah.
You get rid of all those VPN-related performance issues, giving users faster connections, fewer dropped sessions, and a much more seamless workflow.
So it's more secure, more efficient, and more user-friendly. It sounds like ZTNA is the clear winner when it comes to remote access.
It certainly seems to be gaining a lot of traction, and it's rapidly becoming the go-to solution for organizations that are embracing remote work and cloud applications. But let's move on to another compelling ZTA use case, microsegmentation.
Oh, yes, those security islands we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
How does ZTA enhance the effectiveness of microsegmentation? How do they work together?
Well, as we discussed earlier, microsegmentation is all about dividing your network into smaller, more secure zones. And ZTA, it takes this concept to the next level by adding those strong authentication and authorization mechanisms, ensuring that only authorized users and devices can actually access each of those zones.
It's just like adding extra layers of security to those islands, making them even more impenetrable.
Exactly. And this is particularly important in today's, really complex IT environments where data is often spread across multiple clouds and on-premise systems.
So it's like a security puzzle, where each piece has its own lock and key, and ZTA is the master key that unlocks them all.
I like that analogy. And ZTA helps you manage that complexity by providing a unified approach to security across all those different environments. But can you give me some specific examples of how this plays out in real-world scenarios? How does ZTA actually enhance microsegmentation in practice?
Absolutely. One common example is using ZTA to secure traffic between, say, virtual machines in a cloud environment.
So preventing those VMs from talking to each other unless they're authorized to do so.
Precisely. You can use ZTA to create these very specific security policies that dictate which virtual machines can communicate with each other based on their roles, the applications they're running, and, other factors.
It's like creating traffic rules for your virtual city, ensuring that only authorized vehicles can travel on certain roads. I like that. And you can even take this a step further, You can segment traffic based on the individual workloads within those applications.
So, like, treating each application component as its own mini zone with its own specific security rules.
Exactly. It's about applying that principle of least privilege down to the most granular level possible.
It's like having a security guard at every single desk in the office, making sure everyone is only accessing the information they're supposed to be accessing.
Yeah.
But what about securing those software as a service applications, those SaaS applications? That seems a bit trickier, doesn't it? I mean, they're often outside that traditional security perimeter.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you apply ZTA to those?
You're right. SaaS applications, they can often present a real security blind spot for many organizations. But that's where ZTA can really step in and provide some much-needed visibility and control.
So how does ZTA actually help organizations regain control over their SaaS applications, especially when it comes to things like user access and data protection? I mean, those are the big concerns with SaaS, right? You're basically trusting a third-party provider to keep your data safe.
Absolutely. And ZTA helps address those concerns by, first and foremost, enforcing their same strong authentication and authorization policies we've been talking about all along. So no more relying on those weak passwords or even shared accounts, which, are unfortunately still all too common. With ZTA, you can ensure that every single user accessing a SaaS application is properly authenticated, ideally using things like multi-factor authentication or even device-based authentication.
So it's like adding this extra layer of security to those SaaS login screens, making it much harder for those unauthorized users to gain access. It's like having a bouncer at the door, checking IDs, even for those people who look familiar.
Exactly. And ZTA also gives you more granular control over what users can actually do within those SaaS applications. It's not just about controlling who gets in, but also about what they can do once they're inside.
So you can actually define policies that limit access to certain features, certain data, or even specific actions within a SaaS application, all based on the user's role, the device they're using, or other contextual factors. It's like having a virtual security guard following them around within the SaaS application, making sure they're not doing anything they shouldn't be doing.
Exactly. It's about being proactive, not just reactive.
Right.
And this granular control is essential for protecting sensitive data, especially when you're dealing with those third-party providers.
Right. You need to make sure you're not giving those providers more access to your data than they absolutely need. But what about those hybrid and multi-cloud environments that are becoming increasingly common? How does ZTA handle the complexity of securing resources that are spread across different cloud providers and on-premise systems? It seems like that would be a nightmare to manage.
It can be. It's like trying to manage the security from multiple houses, each with its own locks, alarm systems, and security guards. And that complexity can create gaps in your security posture, making it much harder to protect your data and comply with those ever-increasing regulations. But that's where ZTA really shines. It provides a unified security framework that spans all of your environments, regardless of whether they're on premises, in the public cloud, or in a private cloud.
So it's like having one master key that unlocks all the doors, one alarm system that covers all the houses, and one security team that patrols all the properties.
Exactly. ZTA, it gives you that single pane of glass view of your entire security landscape, making it much easier to manage those policies, monitor activity, and respond to threats. But what are the tangible benefits of this unified approach? How does it actually translate into real-world improvements for an organization?
Yeah, I'm curious about that too. It sounds great in theory, but how does it actually play out in practice?
Well, one of the major benefits is centralized access control. With ZTA, you can manage access to all of your resources, regardless of where they're located, from a single point. So it doesn't matter if it's a server in your data center, a virtual machine in the cloud, or a SaaS application hosted by a third-party provider, you can control it all from one central location.
So it's like having one security checkpoint for all your IT assets, no matter where they reside.
Precisely. And this makes it much easier to enforce those consistent security policies across your entire organization. And it can also simplify user access management, especially if you have, a distributed workforce spread across multiple locations.
So no more having to manage separate logins and permissions for each cloud platform or application.
That's the idea. ZTA can integrate with your existing identity management systems to provide that seamless and secure single sign-on experience for your users. It's all about making security as frictionless as possible while still maintaining those high levels of protection.
Okay, so centralized access control is a big plus, but what about data protection? How does ZTA actually ensure that those crown jewels, that sensitive data, is protected, no matter where it's stored or processed?
That's another critical benefit. It provides that consistent data protection. So with ZTA, you can apply those same strong encryption and data loss prevention policies we talked about earlier to all of your data, regardless of where it lives.
So it's like having this single, unbreakable safe that protects your data no matter where it travels.
Exactly. And that's essential for organizations that are subject to those strict data privacy regulations like GDPR. You need to be able to demonstrate that you're protecting that personal data, regardless of where it's stored or who has access to it. And ZTA helps you do that.
Sounds like ZTA is like having an automated compliance officer constantly monitoring your data handling practices, making sure you're ticking all the boxes.
That's a great way to think about it. But, beyond access control and data protection, ZTA also dramatically improves visibility and control over your entire IT environment. You can see all of your network traffic regardless of where it's originating or where it's going.
So it's like having a network traffic control tower, giving you that bird's eye view of everything that's happening across your entire digital landscape.
Exactly. And with that improved visibility, you can detect and respond to security incidents much more quickly and effectively, limiting their impact and preventing them from spreading across those different environments.
It really sounds like ZTA is a must-have for any organization that's embracing those hybrid and multi-cloud strategies.
I would say so, yes. It's the key to managing the complexity and the security challenges of these modern IT environments. But, let's venture into a domain that's often overlooked but becoming increasingly critical: operational technology, or OT.
OT. It's the realm of industrial systems, right? The stuff that keeps the lights on, the factories running, the world moving.
Exactly. OT, it encompasses those industrial control system, ICS, the Industrial Internet of Things, IoT, and all that critical infrastructure like power grids, water treatment plants, manufacturing facilities, transportation systems, all the things that keep our modern society functioning. And, it's becoming increasingly connected to the digital world, which, well, that opens up all sorts of new security risks.
So it's no longer this separate, isolated world. It's part of that interconnected digital landscape, which means that it needs that same level of protection as our traditional IT systems, right?
Absolutely. And unfortunately, many OT systems, especially those legacy systems that have been in place for years, weren't designed with security as a top priority.
Yeah, back then it was all about reliability and efficiency, not so much about cybersecurity.
Exactly. So these legacy systems, they might not support those modern security protocols, or they may not have the processing power to handle those complex encryption algorithms. It's a bit of a clash between the old and the new.
So how do you bridge that gap? You can't just rip and replace all those legacy systems overnight. I mean, that's just not feasible for most organizations, right?
You're right. That's where those gateways or proxies come in. They can act as intermediaries between those legacy OT devices and your modern ZTA infrastructure.
So it's like having a translator who can speak both the language of the old OT systems and the language of those new ZTA solutions.
I like that analogy. Another challenge is that OT environments, they often have really strict performance and availability requirements. You can't afford to have any downtime when you're managing things like power grids or manufacturing processes.
Yeah, a few seconds of downtime could have catastrophic consequences in those environments.
Exactly. So you need to make absolutely sure that your ZTA solution doesn't introduce any latency or disrupt those critical operations.
So finding that sweet spot, that balance between security and performance, is absolutely key.
Absolutely. And one more consideration is that skills gap we talked about earlier. Many OT professionals, they're just not as familiar with those modern cybersecurity practices as their IT counterparts. So training and education are really essential for successful ZTA implementation in those OT environments.
So it's not just about deploying the technology, it's about empowering the people who will be using and managing that technology.
Precisely. It's a cultural shift as much as a technological one.
Well, this OT security stuff, it's a whole other can of worms that we could probably spend hours discussing. But let's shift gears for a moment and talk about another technology that's pushing the boundaries of ZTA, 5G.
Ah, yes. 5G, it's certainly generating a lot of buzz, and for good reason. With its super fast speeds, low latency, and massive capacity, 5G is, well, it's poised to revolutionize how we connect and communicate. It's the foundation for all sorts of exciting new technologies like autonomous vehicles, smart cities, remote surgery, the list goes on and on.
It really is the next generation of connectivity. It's going to change everything. But I imagine that it also presents some pretty significant security challenges as well.
It definitely does. While 5G is, incredibly exciting, it also significantly expands the attack surface for those cyber attacks, giving those malicious actors more opportunities to exploit those vulnerabilities.
So it's like building a bigger, faster highway, but forgetting to put up any guardrails or speed limits.
That's a great analogy. And one of the biggest concerns with 5G is the security of the network itself. Because 5G networks are primarily software defined, they're much more vulnerable to those attacks that target the underlying software.
So if an attacker gains control of that software, they could potentially wreak havoc on the entire network.
Potentially, yes. They could disrupt communications, intercept data, even launch denial of service attacks, you name it.
So the stakes are incredibly high when it comes to 5G security. But 5G, it's not just about the network itself, right? It's also about all the devices that are going to be connecting to that network. All those IoT devices, those sensors, smartphones, industrial machines. Everything's going to be connected.
You're absolutely right. And that's another major security concern. With 5G, we're going to see an explosion of IoT devices, all collecting and transmitting data at unprecedented speeds and volumes. And if those devices aren't properly secured, well, they can become entry points for those attackers to gain access to the network.
It's like having millions of unlocked doors leading into your house.
Exactly. And it's not just about the number of devices, it's also about the types of devices. We're talking about everything from those simple sensors to those really sophisticated industrial robots, all connected to the same network.
So how do you even begin to manage security at that scale? It seems like a daunting task.
It is, absolutely. And then you add in the whole issue of mobile edge computing, or MEC, which is all about bringing that computing power closer to the edge of the network, processing data and running those applications closer to the users and those devices.
So it's like having these mini data centers spread throughout the network, closer to where the action is.
Precisely. And while MEC offers all sorts of benefits like reduced latency and improved performance, it also means that you have more points to protect, more potential vulnerabilities to address.
So it's a security trade-off. You gain some benefits, but you also increase the complexity of your security landscape.
Exactly. You need to make sure that those edge computing resources are just as secure as your central data centers.
So it's about building security into every layer of that 5G network, from the core to the edge.
Precisely. But with all these security challenges, where does ZTA fit into all of this? Can it really help to secure these next generation 5G networks? Or is it just too much, too complex?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering too. Can ZTA keep up with the pace of innovation in the 5G world?
Well, ZTA is definitely a critical piece of the puzzle when it comes to securing those 5G networks. One of the key areas where it can really help is with software integrity verification.
So making sure that the software running on that 5G network is legitimate and hasn't been tampered with. Kind of like a quality control check for your software.
Exactly. ZTA can use those cryptographic techniques to verify the digital signatures of software updates, ensuring that they're coming from those trusted sources and that they haven't been, infected with some malware.
So it's like having a security guard checking everyone's credentials at the software update door, making sure no one's sneaking in any malicious code.
I like that analogy. And ZTA can also be used to protect against those man-in-the-middle attacks, those MITM attacks, preventing attackers from intercepting and manipulating traffic between those 5G devices and the network.
So it's like having a private encrypted channel for all your 5G communications, making it much harder for those attackers to eavesdrop or tamper with the data that's being transmitted.
Exactly. And finally, ZTA can also play a key role in securing access to that sensitive data that's being collected and processed by all those 5G and IoT devices.
So it's about protecting that data from those unauthorized eyes, making sure that it's only being accessed by those authorized users and applications, even in this new world of 5G and edge computing. But are there any limitations to using ZTA in this context? Is it really up to the challenge of securing these incredibly complex and really rapidly evolving networks?
There are definitely some challenges. One of the big ones is just the sheer scale and complexity of these 5G networks. We're talking about billions of devices, countless connections, terabytes of data flowing every second. It's mind-boggling.
Yeah, it's a lot to wrap your head around.
It is. And managing security at that scale, it's a daunting task. It requires ZTA solutions that are scalable, adaptable, and, can handle the unique demands of 5G.
So those traditional ZTA approaches, they might need some tweaking, some optimization to be truly effective in this new 5G world.
Exactly. And then you add in the rapid pace of innovation in the 5G space. New technologies, new applications, new security threats, they're emerging all the time. So your ZTA solution, it needs to be flexible and adaptable to keep up with these changes. You need a security framework that can evolve as quickly as the threat landscape itself.
It's like trying to hit a moving target. But, speaking of moving targets, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into zero trust architecture. I feel like I've learned a ton.
Me too. It's been a fascinating journey exploring all these different facets of ZTA.
But before we wrap up, I want to make sure we leave our listeners with some key takeaways. What are the essential things they should remember about zero trust architecture? What's the TLDR version, so to speak?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that ZTA represents a fundamental shift in how we think about security. It's moving away from that old castle and moat mentality where we just assume that everything inside the perimeter is safe and that we only need to worry about keeping the bad guys out.
Right. We've been saying that all along. ZTA is built on this principle of never trust, always verify. It's about assuming that those breaches are inevitable and that we need to verify every single access attempt, no matter where it's coming from.
Exactly. We can't just blindly trust that those internal users or those internal devices are, inherently secure. We need to treat every access request with the same level of scrutiny, the same level of skepticism.
So no more free passes just because someone happens to be sitting inside the corporate network.
Precisely. And another key takeaway is that ZTA, it's not just about technology. It's about people, processes, and culture as well. You can have the most sophisticated ZTA solution in the world, but if your employees aren't following basic security best practices, or if your security policies are outdated and ineffective, well, you're still going to be vulnerable.
So it's a holistic approach to security, not just a technological fix.
Exactly. It's about creating that security-aware culture within your organization where everyone understands the importance of security and follows those best practices.
It's about making security everyone's responsibility, not just the IT department's problem. But even with the right tools and the right mindset, ZTA isn't a set it and forget it solution, is it?
You're right about that. It's not something you implement overnight and then just, never think about again. ZTA, it requires that ongoing effort, that constant attention.
So it's a journey, not a destination.
Right, exactly. It's about that continuous improvement, constantly assessing your security posture, adapting to those new threats, and refining those policies and controls.
You're always learning, always adapting, always evolving.
Precisely. And it's important to remember that ZTA, it's not a silver bullet. It's not this magical solution that's going to instantly solve all of your security problems.
Right. It's not going to make you invincible overnight.
Yeah.
But it is a powerful framework that, when implemented effectively, can significantly enhance your security posture, reduce your risk of compromise, and really help you to stay ahead of those ever-evolving threats.
Absolutely. And as we've seen, it can be applied to a wide range of those use cases, from replacing those VPNs for remote access to securing those cloud applications, those hybrid and multi-cloud environments, operational technology, even those next generation 5G networks.
It really seems like ZTA is here to stay and that it's going to play an increasingly important role in shaping the future of security.
I completely agree. It's a really exciting time to be in the security field with all these new technologies and approaches emerging.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, but I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of ZTA. I mean, there's so much more to explore, so many different perspectives and nuances. But for now, I think we'll leave it there.
Sounds good to me.
Well, we hope this deep dive has given you, our listener, a solid understanding of zero trust architecture and why it's so important in today's, increasingly complex and interconnected digital world. And if you're looking to really explore this topic further, we highly recommend checking out the Cloud Security Alliance's website. They have a wealth of information on ZTA, including white papers, case studies, and best practices.
And of course, there's the NIST documentation we mentioned earlier. They provide a lot of really valuable guidance on ZTA implementation.
Absolutely. Those are both excellent resources for anyone who wants to, really dive deep into the nuts and bolts of ZTA. And, remember that ZTA, it's a journey, not a destination. It's about constantly learning, adapting, and evolving your security practices to stay ahead of the curve in this ever-changing digital world.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, we'll wrap things up here. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive into the world of cybersecurity.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time.
Remote access to those systems. In the past, these systems were often air-gapped, completely isolated from the outside world.
Right. It was like, keep those systems locked away in a vault and don't let anyone near them.
Exactly. But, those days are long gone. These days, these OT systems, they're becoming more connected, often for things like remote monitoring and maintenance.
So those engineers can, they can access and manage these systems from anywhere, which is, super convenient. But it also introduces those potential security risks.
Absolutely. That connectivity, while it's beneficial in many ways, it creates a much larger attack surface for those cyber attacks.
Right. So a malicious actor, they could potentially gain access to these really critical systems. And I mean, they could cause some serious disruption, even potentially catastrophic damage, right?
It's definitely a serious concern. We're talking about systems that control things like power grids, water treatment plants, transportation systems. I mean, the potential consequences of an attack on these systems are, they're pretty scary to think about.
Yeah, it's a bit like a Hollywood disaster movie, except it's real life.
Yeah.
So how does it actually help to mitigate those risks? How does it protect these critical OT systems from those attacks?
Well, one way is by using ZTNA, that zero trust network access we talked about earlier, to secure that remote access to those ICS systems. Instead of just giving those remote users full access to the network, ZTNA, it only grants them access to the specific systems and applications they need to do their jobs.
Right. So it's about limiting their access to the bare minimum, following that principle of least privilege. So even if their credentials are compromised, the damage they can do is limited because they only have access to a small slice of the overall system.
Exactly. And ZTNA can also help to prevent what's known as lateral movement within those OT networks. This is a common tactic that attackers use to gain access to those more sensitive systems once they've breached a less secure part of the network.
So it's like, even if they manage to get a foothold, they can't easily spread throughout the entire system.
Right. ZTNA helps to contain that threat and, hopefully minimize the damage.
So it's all about building those walls, those security barriers, not just around the perimeter of the OT environment, but also within the environment itself. It's like a defense in depth approach.
Exactly. But securing that remote access to those ICS systems, it's really just one piece of the OT security puzzle.
Right.
What about all those IoT devices that are, being deployed in these environments?
Right. You're talking about all those sensors, smart meters, industrial robots, all those connected devices that are collecting and transmitting data about those industrial processes. It's like the nervous system of a modern factory, constantly monitoring and reporting on every aspect of the operation.
That's a great analogy. And protecting that data, ensuring the integrity of all those devices, it's absolutely crucial for the security and the reliability of those industrial operations. But, they also present a really tempting target for those attackers.
Right, because if you can compromise those sensors or those controllers, you can potentially manipulate the data they're collecting, or even worse, you could take control of the physical equipment they're connected to.
Exactly. So how do we secure all those IoT devices, especially given that they're often deployed in, large numbers and in some really hard to reach locations?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's not like you can just, install a traditional security agent on every single sensor and call it a day.
Well, one of the key aspects is device authentication. We need to make sure that only those authorized IoT devices are allowed to connect to the network and access those resources.
So it's about establishing that trust at the device level, right?
Right.
Making sure that those devices that are supposed to be there are actually the ones that are there. That no one's, snuck in a rogue device that could be used to cause trouble.
Exactly. And ZTA, it can help with that by using those strong authentication mechanisms to verify the identity of those devices. But what about protecting all the data that these devices are collecting and transmitting?
Yeah, that data is often incredibly sensitive, right? It's the lifeblood of
Yeah.
those industrial operations.
Absolutely. So, we need to protect that data from those prying eyes, both in transit and at rest. And ZTA can help with that by enforcing data encryption.
Right. So even if someone manages to intercept that data, they can't read it without those decryption keys. It's like putting that data in a secure envelope that can only be opened by those authorized personnel.
Exactly. But, we talked earlier about microsegmentation. Does that play a role in securing those OT environments as well?
I was just thinking about that. It seems like it would be a perfect fit. I mean, if you can segment your OT network into those smaller, more isolated zones, you can really limit the potential damage that an attacker could do.
Absolutely. Microsegmentation, it can help to contain the impact of a security breach by isolating those different parts of the OT network from each other. So if one part of the network is compromised, the damage doesn't spread to those other areas.
Right. So it's like creating those fire breaks in a forest. A fire starts in one area. Those fire breaks help to prevent it from spreading and burning down the entire forest.
I like that analogy. But, let's be realistic here. There are definitely challenges to implementing ZTA in those OT environments, right? I mean, these systems, they weren't really designed with modern security in mind, so it's not always a straightforward process.
Yeah, me, I'm almost like looking for those potential pitfalls. What are some of the hurdles that organizations need to overcome when it comes to applying ZTA to those OT environments?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is that many OT devices, especially those legacy systems that have been in place for years, they just weren't designed with security in mind. They may not support those modern security protocols, or they may not have the processing power to handle those complex encryption algorithms. It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
So how do you bridge that gap? You can't just, rip and replace all those legacy systems overnight.
You're right, you can't. That's where those gateways or those proxies we talked about earlier come in. They can act as intermediaries between those legacy OT devices and your modern ZTA infrastructure.
So it's like having a translator who can speak both the language of those old OT systems and the language of those new ZTA solutions.
Exactly. And another challenge is that those OT environments, they often have really strict performance and availability requirements. You can't afford to have any downtime when you're managing things like power grids or manufacturing processes.
Yeah, those systems, they need to be up and running 24/7, 365 days a year. There's no room for error.
Right. So you need to make absolutely sure that your ZTA solution, it doesn't introduce any latency or disrupt those critical operations. You don't want to cause a power outage just because you're trying to implement a new security solution.
Yeah, that would definitely defeat the purpose.
It would. And one more consideration is the skills gap. Many OT professionals, they're just not as familiar with those modern cybersecurity practices as their IT counterparts. So training and education, they're really essential for a successful ZTA implementation in those OT environments.
So it's really a cultural shift as much as a technological one.
Exactly. You need to get everyone on board with this new way of thinking about security.
For this OT security stuff, it's definitely a whole other can of worms, a whole other rabbit hole we could go down. But let's shift gears for a moment and talk about another really game-changing technology that's pushing the boundaries of ZTA.
5G. It's certainly generating a lot of buzz these days, and for good reason. With its super fast speeds, low latency, and just that massive capacity, 5G. It's poised to revolutionize, well, I mean, pretty much everything.
Right, we're talking about the foundation for the future of the connected world. Everything from those self-driving cars to smart cities to remote surgery. It's mind-blowing to think about all the possibilities. But I imagine it also presents some pretty significant security challenges as well, right? I mean, with all that connectivity, all that data flying around, it seems like a pretty tempting target for those cyber criminals.
It definitely does. While 5G, it's incredibly exciting from a technological standpoint, it also expands that attack surface for those cyber attacks pretty dramatically.
So it's like building a bigger, faster highway, but forgetting to put up any guardrails or speed limits.
That's a great analogy. One of the biggest concerns with 5G is the security of the network itself. Because 5G networks, they're primarily software defined. They're much more vulnerable to those attacks that target that underlying software. So if an attacker gains control of that software, well, they could potentially disrupt those communications, intercept that data, even launch those denial of service attacks that could really cripple those critical services.
So the stakes are incredibly high when it comes to 5G security. But, 5G, it's not just about the network itself, is it? It's also about all the devices that will be connecting to that network. And with 5G, we're not just talking about a few laptops and smartphones. We're talking about, potentially billions of devices, everything from those tiny sensors to those massive industrial machines, all connected to the same network.
Exactly. And that's another major security concern. With 5G, we're going to see this massive explosion of IoT devices all collecting and transmitting data at unprecedented speeds and volumes. And if those devices aren't properly secured, well, they can become those entry points for those attackers to gain access to that network and, potentially wreak havoc.
Right. It's like having, millions of unlocked doors leading into your house. So how do you even begin to manage security at that scale?
It's a huge challenge, absolutely. And then you add in this whole issue of mobile edge computing, or MEC, which is this trend of, bringing that computing power closer to the edge of the network, processing that data and running those applications closer to the users in those devices.
Right. So it's like having these mini data centers spread throughout the network closer to where the action is.
Exactly. And while MEC offers a lot of benefits like reduced latency and improved performance, it also means that you have more points to protect, more potential vulnerabilities to address.
So it's a security trade-off, right? You gain some performance benefits, but you increase the complexity of your security landscape.
Exactly. You need to make sure that those edge computing resources, they're just as secure as your central data centers. It's about building that security into every layer of the 5G network, from the core to the edge.
So it's like, instead of just having one castle to defend, you now have, dozens, hundreds, maybe even thousands of smaller fortresses scattered across the landscape, each one needing its own defenses.
That's a great way to put it. But with all these security challenges that 5G brings, the question is, where does ZTA actually fit into all of this? Can it really help to secure these next generation networks, or is it just too complex for ZTA to handle?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering too. Can ZTA really keep up with the pace of innovation in the 5G world? It's a lot to ask of any security framework, right? To adapt to all those new technologies and those new threats that are constantly emerging.
It is. But ZTA, it's definitely a critical piece of that puzzle when it comes to securing 5G. One of the key areas where it can really help is with software integrity verification.
So making sure that the software running on those 5G networks is legitimate and hasn't been tampered with. It's like having a quality control check for your software.
Exactly. ZTA can use those cryptographic techniques to verify those digital signatures of software updates, making sure that they're coming from those trusted sources and that they haven't been infected with some sort of malware.
So it's like having a security guard checking everyone's credentials at the software update door, making sure that no one's sneaking in any malicious code.
Exactly. And, ZTA can also be used to protect against those man-in-the-middle attacks, those MITM attacks, preventing those attackers from intercepting and manipulating traffic between 5G devices and that network.
So it's like having a private encrypted channel for all your 5G communications, making it much harder for those attackers to eavesdrop or tamper with the the data that's being transmitted.
Exactly. And finally, ZTA can also play a key role in securing access to all that sensitive data that's being collected and processed by those 5G and IoT devices.
Right. It's about protecting that data from those unauthorized eyes, ensuring its confidentiality and integrity, even in this new world of 5G and edge computing. But are there any limitations to using ZTA in this context? I mean, is it really up to the challenge of securing these incredibly complex and rapidly evolving networks?
There are certainly challenges. One is just the sheer scale and complexity of those 5G networks. We're talking about, potentially billions of devices, countless connections, terabytes of data flowing every second. It's mind-boggling. And managing security at that scale, it's a daunting task. You need ZTA solutions that are scalable, adaptable, that can handle the unique demands of 5G. So those traditional ZTA approaches, they might need some tweaking, some optimization to be truly effective in this new 5G environment.
Right. You need to adapt your tools and your strategies to match the scale and the speed of these new networks.
Exactly. And then there's the rapid pace of innovation in the 5G space. New technologies, new applications, new security threats, they're emerging all the time. So, your ZTA solution, it needs to be flexible, it needs to be adaptable to keep up with these changes. You need a security framework that can evolve as quickly as the threat landscape itself.
So it's like trying to hit a moving target. The landscape is constantly shifting beneath your feet.
It is. And then you have to think about interoperability. With so many different players in the 5G ecosystem, how do you make sure that your ZTA solution can work seamlessly with all those different components? How do you make sure that everything can talk to each other and that you don't end up with these silos of security that can create those vulnerabilities?
It's like creating a harmonious security orchestra where all the instruments are playing in tune, working together to create this beautiful symphony of security. But despite all these challenges, it seems pretty clear that ZTA is a critical piece of the puzzle when it comes to securing those 5G networks.
It definitely is. 5G security, it's not something you can just, tack on as an afterthought. It needs to be baked into the design of these networks from the very beginning, from the ground up. And that's where ZTA can really play a vital role in shaping the future of 5G security.
Well, this has been an incredible journey. I feel like we've really gone deep into the world of zero trust architecture, exploring its history, its principles, its benefits, its challenges, its real-world applications. I mean, we've covered it all.
I agree. It's been a fascinating conversation.
But before we wrap things up, I want to make sure we leave our listeners with some key takeaways. What are the essential things they should remember about zero trust architecture? What are the things that will help them to, really understand and appreciate the power and the potential of ZTA?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that ZTA, it represents a fundamental shift in how we think about security. It's moving away from that old castle and moat mentality where we just assume that everything inside the perimeter is safe and that we only need to worry about keeping those bad guys out.
Right. We've been saying that all along. ZTA is built on that principle of never trust, always verify. It's about assuming that those breaches are inevitable and that we need to verify every single access attempt, no matter where it's coming from.
Exactly. We can't just blindly trust that those internal users or those internal devices are inherently secure. We need to treat every single access request with the same level of scrutiny, the same level of skepticism.
So no more free passes just because someone happens to be sitting inside the corporate network. Everyone needs to prove their trustworthiness every single time.
Precisely. And another key takeaway is that ZTA, it's not just about technology, it's also about people, processes, and culture. You can have the most sophisticated ZTA solution in the world, but if your employees aren't following those basic security best practices, or if your security policies are, outdated and ineffective, well, you're still going to be vulnerable.
So it's a holistic approach to security.
Yeah.
It's not just about implementing the latest shiny tools and technologies. It's about creating a security-aware culture within your organization where everyone understands the importance of security and follows those best practices.
Absolutely. It's about making security everyone's responsibility, not just the IT department's problem.
Right. Because security, it's not just a technical issue, it's a business issue. It's everyone's issue. But, even with the right tools and the right mindset, ZTA, it's not a set it and forget it solution, is it? It's not something you just, check off your to-do list and then never think about it again.
You're absolutely right. It's a journey, not a destination. It's about that continuous improvement, constantly assessing your security posture, adapting to those new threats, refining those policies and controls.
So you're always learning, always adapting, always evolving. It's about staying one step ahead of those bad guys.
Precisely. And, you know, it's important to remember that ZTA, it's not a silver bullet. It's not a magical solution that's going to instantly solve all your security problems. But it is a powerful framework that, when implemented effectively, can significantly enhance your security posture, reduce your risk of compromise, and really help you to stay ahead of those ever-evolving threats.
Absolutely. And as we've seen, it's incredibly versatile. It can be applied to a wide range of those use cases, from replacing those VPNs for remote access to securing those cloud applications, those hybrid and multi-cloud environments, that operational technology, even those next generation 5G networks.
It's a powerful tool that has the potential to really transform the way we think about and approach security in the digital age.
Well, we hope this deep dive has given you, our listener, a solid understanding of zero trust architecture and why it's so important in today's increasingly complex and interconnected digital world. And if you're looking to explore this topic further, we highly recommend checking out the Cloud Security Alliance's website. They have a wealth of information on ZTA, including those white papers, those case studies, those best practices, everything you need to really get started on your ZTA journey.
And of course, there's the NIST documentation that we've mentioned a few times. They provide a lot of really valuable guidance on ZTA implementation.
Absolutely. Those are both excellent resources for anyone who really wants to dive deep into the nuts and bolts of ZTA. And just remember, ZTA, it's a journey, not a destination. It's about constantly learning, adapting, and evolving those security practices to stay ahead of the curve in this ever-changing digital world.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap things up here. Thank you so much for joining us for another deep dive into the world of cybersecurity. We hope you found it informative and engaging.
It's been a pleasure.
And we'll see you next time.